Welcome to Racism is Real, where we tackle the urgent realities of racism in our society. In this series, we explore the systems of oppression that continue to harm marginalized communities and the movements working to create change. Through powerful conversations with activists, educators, and thought leaders, we aim to uncover the truth and take steps towards justice.
Hi everyone, and happy Black History Month. Welcome to the Racism is Real series. Today we have joining us Dr. Deborah Harris and Drick Boyd. Please introduce yourselves and how you would like to be addressed.
Starting with me?
That's okay.
Okay, all righty. Deborah is fine. I am a lifelong educator, having taught in public schools for 10 years and at the university level for 18 years. And then I have a business as an educational consultant where I facilitate the inclusion of children with disabilities. That is my passion and my calling that has been blended for a life well lived.
Thank you. Mr. Drake?
Hi, my name is Drick Boyd. I'm a professor emeritus of urban and interdisciplinary studies from Eastern University in the Philadelphia area. And my interest in our topic for tonight is I've probably spent the last 12 to 13 years working on educational justice issues in Pennsylvania. And so this is something very near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, guys. I'm your host, Gracie Lane, a freshman in high school and a future teacher. Today, we're going to be diving into the topic, fighting for equitable schools. Let's get into it. I have a few questions for you guys. The first question is, how does the lack of diverse curriculum impact students of color in predominantly white schools or schools in general? Who would like to start?
Drick, I'm gonna let you start.
Oh, okay. So when I saw this question, I thought of an experience I had many, many years ago. I started out as a youth worker in the Boston, Massachusetts area, and the Star Wars movies were just coming out. Star Wars 1 was just coming out, and I was working with a group of Puerto Rican young men, and I invited them to come with me, and I take them to the Star Wars. So we went and saw Star Wars, and at the end of the movie, the leader of the group, he sort of spoke out and says, "Well, guys, doesn't look too good for us. There were no Puerto Ricans in the future." And you know, he kind of said it in a funny way, so we all laughed. But I've often thought of that comment because, yes, in that movie, there, what I could count, were a couple persons of color, and neither of them were Puerto Rican. But more importantly, when I think of the question about students of color in our schools, predominantly white schools or schools in general, in light of what's been happening in the last few years around book banning, and now the president has come out and said he wants to revise the way history is told. Authors, you know, like Richard Wright or James Baldwin or Alice Walter and Toni Morrison are off the shelf, and so thinking of the kids that I took to the movie years and years ago, I thought, you know, I can only imagine that being a student of color in that kind of context would say, well, where am I? Who do I get to identify with? And usually, you know, in those kind of schools, at the same time, there are very few teachers of color. So even having someone who either you can look up to, you can identify with, or just go to because of the way things often happen, you know, the microaggressions, as well as just policies that schools have that often exclude or diminish the impact that the students of color can have. So it's, to me, that seems it would be a very tough thing for anybody in that kind of context. And I think of W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that we have to, you know, he was speaking of African Americans at that time, we ever feel our two-ness, you know, we're African American, but when we go out into the public sphere, we have to kind of put on a different face. And to try and adjust. And so even just trying to figure out who you are at that point in life, it can be very tough, I would think, for those students. So just those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
I hear you. It's kind of like code switching. In one situation, you're acting like this, and then when you go somewhere else, you have to make sure you are equipped for that type of situation. So that makes a lot of sense. Dr. Harris, do you have anything to say?
That's I love that, but I would also like to add to that a quote I read some years ago, and it has resurfaced more in my mind in the last, oh gosh, since January than I've ever witnessed before. And that is a quote by Carter G. Woodson when he wrote in 1913, The Miseducation of the Negro. And here's what he said. He said, if you make a person think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. Here's the power. When you control a person's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. And while that was written about the miseducation of the Negro, what I'm seeing now is the miseducation of America, part two of the miseducation of the Negro. And here's why I say that's so important. Because the banning books, the changing of curricula, the movement more toward vouchers to make public education more minority, so that the quality of education actually goes down. To me, those are all efforts to control people's thinking. And when you control that thinking, they don't have to worry about the actions. So it's very painful for me to see a lot of what's going on now. And I always end with this question, what can I do about it? And I think it's a question that we all have to ask ourselves if we are truly, truly Americans, because this is a diverse nation. It has always been, it will always be, and we cannot disregard certain portions because their color, because of the color of their skin or their cultural makeup or whatever.
Thank you so much for input, guys.
Just add one thought to it. Yeah, I think too, in a way that is not highly recognized, that this is a great deficit for white students as well, because they get a very whitewashed, literally, view of history, view of literature, view of the world, and doesn't prepare them for, like what you just said, we're a very culturally mixed nation, and they aren't prepared. I know I wasn't when I was coming up as a young person. Mm-hmm. A lot of things that I just was told were true turned out to be untrue, and I had to unlearn a lot before I could learn what was actually going on.
And I'm glad you brought that point up, because to commit yourself to learning about others is a choice. It is not, it cannot be mandated by law. However, law or politics can influence it in such a way that you don't even realize that there is an option. It's just as like it's all one. This is all white. So when they're trying to say there is no Black culture, there is no Hispanic culture, there is no women's culture. I mean, when they say that, that is a miseducation. Why?
Right.
Because there is. All of that is what comprises America. And so we have to be willing to step out there and make a difference and really say, no, we can't do this. You can't erase those histories because it's all a part of who America is. And they go, well, it's just all about Americans. But then you want to throw away MLK Day. You want to throw away LGBTQ. You want to throw away this. You want to, come on, seriously? Where is it?
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I love the input that y'all gave out. We hear a lot of good things today. If we're done with this, we can move on to the next question.
Can I ask you one question, Grace, before you go? You mentioned code switching, and I was surprised because that was certainly something that was pounded into us when we were younger.
Mhm.
But to hear your generation speak of it says that that is still the expectation. Is that correct?
I feel like it can be. It depends on where you are, which is also code switching. So, like, if I'm in a situation where it's very professional, then I'm going to be professional. But if I'm in a situation where it's just me and my friends, then I might not be as professional as I am at the professional setting. So that could also be a version of code switching and not as extreme as what your generation might have done. If we're done with this question, we can move on to the next. My next question is, what role do standardized tests play in perpetuating inequality in education?
Okay, I'll start with that one because that's one of those things that's been a pet peeve of mine forever. When I was in grad school, one of the things we had to do was we were learning how to do the psychological, or learning the understanding the psychological batteries. And so a colleague and mine, a friend and mine, we practiced on each other's kids. And I said to her one day, I said, Denise, when you give my daughter this test, I'd be very interested in how she answers this one question. And now that question is no longer on the battery, but it was, where does bacon come from? That used to be, okay? And I said, because of our faith, we don't eat pork. So I am sure my daughter's not going to know that it comes from bacon. I mean, from a pig. And she says, oh, she'll know that. That's just common sense. And sure enough, she said turkey. Like, I imagine some people might say plant-based now, given that there's so much plant-based, but whatever. And she got it wrong. Well, that would have cost her points in her total battery. And so I found that really intriguing. But here it is. Since the inception, a century ago, standardized tests have been instruments of racism and a biased system. Typically, individuals who are of color, particularly those from a low income bracket, they suffer the most from this high stakes testing, and you rarely see what they really know and in the testing. And I want to read a quote, and then I will give you a personal example. This is a quote by Ibram Kendi. And it says, we still think there's something wrong with kids rather than recognizing there's something wrong with the test. He's a professor at Boston University, and he wrote a book on how to be an anti-racist. And this is what he said about standardized tests, which I thought was phenomenal. Standardized tests have become the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade Black and brown minds and legally exclude their bodies from prestigious schools. This is why I go, man, I can't believe those who were a part of the affirmative action are now anti-affirmative action, because if it were not for affirmative action, some people would not have had the chance to really show what they do know. And that just the example I gave earlier about my daughter responding to the test, it wasn't her intellect, it was her experience. She just had not done that. There was a test a long time ago, I forget the gentleman who was the developer of it, but it was called the BITCH, the Black Intelligence Test for Children. And they gave it to children, white children, and they all failed miserably, but it was totally based on Black culture. And all of them were considered, at the time they used the word morons, but not now. But that just shows, these tests can be culturalized. My story that wraps all of this up is when I've never been a good test taker, but I've always been a very visionary, very hardworking, creative student. Okay, with pretty good writing skills. When I went to apply for grad school, I took the GRE, and I think I got like 600 on it. You get that for writing your name, right? And so, and I'll never forget, at the time they were only accepting 6 students. So I called, I got a note saying that I wasn't accepted. So I called Dr. Jim Paul and I said, well, he said, well, we want you to study. We think you'll be a good candidate, but we'd like for you to study and try next year. We've already selected our 6 people for the year. I went, okay. I said, well, can I come up and just meet with everybody? I just want to see if this is going to be a good fit for me. I want to talk to people, blah, blah, blah. He said, sure. So he set me up a day. At the end of the day, they offered me one of the spots because he said, it is obvious that the GRE does not reflect your intelligence and your ability. And I said, thank you. But I knew that about me, that if you only went what was on the test score, you wouldn't allow me in your front door. But if you gave me the opportunity, my true gifts, my intellect would come forth. And people would say, oh, well, that's affirmative action, da, da, da. You didn't really do well. Well, I was the first one in my class finished. I was the only one who got a full dissertation research grant for it, and a number of other things that I accomplished. And I think about that often. Man, if I just would have said, okay, I failed the test. I didn't do well on the test. What can I do? Nothing.
So Dr. Harris, you said that you were quoting someone and he said that standardized tests are very racist. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I do, because I've experienced it. Yes, I do.
Okay. Mr. Drick, you can go ahead and answer.
Yeah, a lot of what I would share would reflect what Barbara shared in terms of the bias that's been proven over and over again, not just by anecdotal experience that we've heard here, but in experts looking at this and seeing that it's very culturally biased. The other thing, that it's very class biased.
Yes.
In the sense that if you go into wealthy communities, you will see these special offices that tutor kids how to take the SAT and how to take the ACT and how to take, these standardized tests, which are the doorway for a lot of people to get into school. Well, if you don't have the access to those kind of things, you're already behind the 8 ball. No matter, and then you add the cultural piece, which I did a little look on the history when these tests were still first instituted. It was really sort of a white supremacist way of proving people who took the test and did well were somehow in some sort of elite category. And like your daughter, I had a student who was just a brilliant student. She was an excellent writer. When she had to speak up in class, she had excellent things to say. She was a good public speaker, but she could not take a multiple choice test to save her life. Mm-hmm. And I had her for 2 classes, and I finally said, we need to sit down. Well, let's talk about a strategy for getting through these tests, because obviously your problem is not that you don't know the answer. Yep. The problem is that something about the multiple choice test really causes you to freeze. And she fortunately went on. She's now a professor of social work at the University of Kentucky, one of the best students, one of the brightest students I've ever had. But, there are certain things that are, through no fault of one's own, they just don't know how to take those things and can often work against them. And a lot of low-income students don't have the opportunity to get mentored on how to get through all that. So, and it leaves them on the outs.
You just ushered in another whole slate of thoughts that I have to bring up at this point. Individuals with disabilities. People think that if an individual has a disability, that automatically means they cannot do it. And most often, it's not that they can't. It's the way that we are expecting them to respond that does not align with the way they learn and what they can give back. So my work is on understanding disabilities beyond the label and helping teachers know how to integrate children with disabilities in the general ed classroom. It requires a total refashioning of their thinking. And actually, I'm getting into the next question, but it requires a refashioning of their thinking because if they do hang on to traditional methods, they will never tap into what these kids can do and do know. So I just want to drop that there because when we talk about the next question about programs that could be replicated, I had planned to bring some of that in, but you triggered me when you were talking because everything you said is true for children with disabilities as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. And although we are talking about just race, there are so many other factors that are harmed, like ability in class. So, yeah. There is one comment. So, if we could look at the comments so we can. What can be done now to support communities who are being even more harmed and divided in the current political climate for education? Does somebody want to answer? Okay, go ahead.
I will just sort of share what I and some others have been talking about because, and I'm thinking particularly with students of color because of the book banning and all that sort of thing. You know, there was a time when churches and community groups had what sometimes were called freedom schools or popular education, which really provided young people with their history, their culture, all of that thing that was not only not covered in the school, but was really looked down upon. And it's occurred to me and to those of us who are sort of talking about this, that this may be one of those times again that those of us who value this as part of being a human being and part of being an American need to say, well, okay, if you're not going to do it in school, then we'll have to, you know, bring folks together in some other form. Because when I looked at some of the books that were banned, I mean, they were books that I assigned in my classes, you know, and they were transformative kinds of texts for a lot of my students, both white and Black and Hispanic. So,
I love that idea, and I think what has been reshaped I'll just say in the Black culture in particular, because I really can't speak for other cultures, but in the Black community, there just used to be this nucleus of, well, let me just put it this way, this village where we all took responsibility for each other's children and we took responsibility for their future. And if we saw them on the streets and they said we could just, you know, we could take any child and chastise them and say, get your act together kind of thing. Well, you better not do that now.
Yeah, I get some trouble now.
You better not do that now. But I think back on those days, and as a young child, I was very talkative, if you can imagine. And I would get in trouble every single day for talking. And my mother, on my way home, my mother would be waiting me at the top of the hill ready to render punishment. But before I got to my mother, Miss Cremati would say, Deborah, I heard you were talking in school today. And I'm going, how did she find out? You know, and then I'd get to the next a few houses up. They go, Deborah, I hear you were talking in school today. I go, God. And then my mom was, I hear you were running your mouth today. But you know, today we don't even know our neighbors' names, let alone their kids. And so there would have to be some type of deliberate and intentional effort to make that happen, to bring that unity together. I've heard people say one of the greatest things that we've lost with the integration of schools is that Black teacher or mama would say, you got to get your education. That's all you got. And you push. And now it's kind of like, well, can't say that, but you know, they're doing everything else, so we may as well.
Yeah, I had a professor, an African-American professor, who talked about growing up in segregation. And he said, there are a lot of things that were not good, but one of the good things was, you know, everybody lived together regardless of their profession. So you might have a janitor living on one side and you got a professor and a doctor across the street and a business person. And So you had many different role models of what you could be, whereas now that isn't often the case.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. As we're closing, we can answer this last question and share our final thoughts. The last question is, what are some successful models of equitable education reform that can be replicated?
Well, the work I do is inclusive education. It's strategically blending students with disabilities into general education classrooms, so they're not seen as coming in, but being a part of. We've had a lot of success, but it is a systemic approach. It cannot happen with just one little person over here, one little person over here. The entire system must change. And when I'm saying system, I'm talking schools. And if we can get it to the schools, it would eventually go into the communities. We've had a lot of success in that, but there's still a lot of work to do. I do worry about the impact that this whole movement, anti-DEI movement, which includes children with disabilities, and the doing away with the Department of Education, the impact it will have on children with disabilities. Interestingly, if we can replicate some of the principles of that program, that grows across color, income, anybody can have a child with disabilities. And it's so important to say this is really about including all children, regardless of their needs or differences.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. Mr. Drick?
Well, something I've been working on for about the last 12 years is education justice around funding of public education. In Pennsylvania, as in most states, public education is supported by a combination of property tax in the local community and then outside sources, largely from the states, sometimes from the federal government, but usually from the states. And in Pennsylvania, we discovered, using the legislature's own data, that they had a pattern of favoring schools that were predominantly white over students that had predominantly students of color. And it didn't have they both could be middle-class communities, they could be poor communities, they could be wealthy communities. The whiter a school district was in terms of its student makeup, the more money they got from the state. And so we've been fighting the legislature for 12 years, even to the point of going to the Commonwealth Court. I mean, we just went to the highest court and won a class action suit. But now we have to get the Republicans to actually do what the court said. I mean, that seems to be a pattern with the Republican Party right now at all levels, that just because the court says you got to do something, they don't necessarily want to do it. And so, and that translates into not only the condition of the schools, but even whether they have people talk to me about having books from the 1960s and the 1980s. And that just would not be the case in a suburban school. So that really gets to something that I think is often assumed, that urban schools are just bad because urban kids are bad. Right. But it's not that. They're underfunded. And in Philadelphia, we have a major problem with the conditions in schools. People are getting sick by just going to school because of bacteria and mold and that sort of thing that aren't taken care of, and lack of cool, air conditioning in the summer when it's hot and heat in the winter. And you can't learn. I went into one school and the principal said, every time it rains sort of hard, all our toilets overflow.
Oh, Jesus.
This just should not be. And yet, in a lot of our lower income communities, both rural and urban, people are just going to school, but in very inequitable and unsafe in many ways conditions.
Oh, that sounds just like segregation years. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your input, everyone. So it is time to come to a close, but please share your contact information and final thoughts. Dr. Harris?
Deborah Harris, Inc. at Well, my website is deborahharrisinc.com, but deborahharrisinc@gmail.com is the best way to reach me. And if there's anything I can answer, or do, please do not hesitate. I'm a fierce advocate for the needs of children with disabilities in particular, but all children in general.
Thank you so much, Mr. Drick.
Drick Boyd, drick.boyd@gmail.com is how you can reach me, or at drickboyd.org at my website. And for me, education has always been a core issue, and it opens so many doors when it works. But when we have a system that systemically cripples people from actually getting the kind of education they need, to me, it's just a travesty, and something that I'm committed to working to change.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have been your host, Grace Elaine, and this is Racism is Real. Until next time.
All right.
That's all for today's conversation on Racism is Real. Thank you to our incredible guests for sharing their insights, and thank you for tuning in. Remember, awareness is the first step, but action is where the change happens. If you found today's discussion valuable, this series will return every second Tuesday evening. Also, be sure to check out our website and follow us for more information and topics like these. And consider making a donation to support our work. Together, we can challenge systems of oppression and work toward a more just future. See you next time.